Okay, I'm gonna dim the lights a bit while we get started here. I think that during the day, because we've got sunlight yet, we don't necessarily need my little clip lamp. But eventually we'll have sort of other ambient lighting here to help. This is good enough for people, right, to take notes with? I figured if I can see my notes, you should be able to see yours, but I'm closer to the screen, so maybe that helps a lot, right? Okay, so what I've got in front of us here is the cover to an exhibition from 1936 that was hosted by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, what we call MoMA. I kind of like that as mother, right? The Museum of Modern Art, the mother for artists. Exhibition catalog on abstract art and cubism that they mounted in 1936, when the art world had kind of moved past that into something entirely different. And so they had a retrospective, and the Museum of Modern Art was relatively new at the time as well, right? MoMA only opened, I think, in 1932 or so, right? So it's a relatively young institution at that point. And it is a flowchart, right? How do we get modern art? What goes where, right? And as you can see, it's a little confusing, but I always thought it would be kind of fun to do this as a project. How do we see Japanese prints influencing Fauvism? You won't know anything because we haven't covered it yet, right? But we'll get there. In any event, the definition of modern art has always been a little difficult, right? What art isn't modern to the people who see it when it's new, right? When we think about modern art, we're sort of saying, okay, it's everything sort of 20th century. That's kind of what we're talking about, right? And now we're deep into the 21st century, so it's not really all that modern anymore, right? But, there was a pupil of Michelangelo back in the Renaissance, a guy named Giorgio Vasari, wrote the lives of the 70 most eminent artists. He was trying to write an art history, right? Because he was fairly proud of the achievements of the Renaissance. He wanted to sort of trace it through, right? And what he said was that Giotto, this 14th century painter, was the founder of modern art. Because that was modern to him, right? So what are we talking about when we talk about modern art, right? It's a little bit more difficult. Lately, I would say since the middle of the 20th century, modern art has come to define 20th century art. It's a term usually used specifically for that. But the definition even went a little bit further than that. It's a sort of some principles, some ideas, some approaches to art that are shared and passed along. The ex-curator of paintings at MoMA, died of brain aneurysm, wrote a book where he likened it to a rugby game. Right, where the idea of the avant-garde is being passed from person to person as they muscle their way down the field. He was a rugby player at Yale before he was an art historian, right? And he had this great analogy of us moving our way, sort of marching down the field as we make this progress, right? A set of principles passed from one movement to another, like what we see here. He wasn't around when this was done, right? Much younger than that. Kirk Varnado, we used to call him Captain Kirk. He was in my graduate school. Because he wore leather and had a motorcycle. Again, it's also, he was Kirk T. Varnado, and we think of James T. Kirk, right? Captain Kirk, right? Anyway, long and short of that is, what are these principles that are going to be passed down? That's kind of what we're going to set up, the road to modernism. We'll begin to talk about certain ideas that we're going to see sort of picked up in one way or another in almost every movement we're going to look at. Right? From the chart, you can see it's almost always sort of traced to its 19th century roots. Now, this idea that modernism is equated with the 20th century has led to sort of certain other ideas, like the idea of postmodernism, which you may have heard. That somehow, how can we be past modern, right? But we often talk about works of art or even periods of time or modes of understanding or communication as being postmodern. And the reason we say that is that we've now come to think of modernism not as what is contemporary today, but rather we think of modernism as this sort of 75-year period, right? Sort of from 1890 through the early 1960s. And there's certain things that are somewhat summed up with this, that are passed through these different movements, that at a certain point, artists of the late 60s, 70s, and 80s began to say, I'm done with that. I'm moving on to something entirely different. So what do we do if we're calling that modern? Right? This other group becomes postmodern, right? Reflective past that. So what we're going to start off with today is beginning to look at some late 19th century art, and we'll work with this on Friday as well. Let me finish the sentence, I'll get you, okay? So today and on Friday, we'll look at some late 19th century art that begins to set the stage for where we're headed. Eleanor.
Is like contemporary art a technical term for actually modern, like what's happening now art, or is it just what we call what's happening now?
Well, that's okay. There's a question in there I don't know if I can truly answer or not, but I'll do the best I can. I'll repeat it for the microphone. Is contemporary? Let me see. This is what you're saying. Is contemporary art just art of now, or is it?
Like, is it what we're going to call what happens now in the future, or is it what we're going to call what's happening then?
Will there be such a thing as post-contemporary art?
Yeah.
I would imagine that only if we have some sort of total eruption in the Einstein time-space continuum, right? But I think that contemporary art will continue to be used for art of the now. That's a nice way of putting it, the now. I hadn't thought of that before. It's a great way to put it, the art of the now, right? What's interesting, though, Eleanor, is a sidelight to that, is that sometimes when we talk about contemporary art, we will throw it all the way back to like the feminist movement in the early 70s, and begin to talk about that as contemporary art, right? Or performance art of the mid-60s even, which is sort of mind-blowing in its concept, even though some of the ideas are not up on this. Yeah, Dada is sort of the basis of all of that, right? So contemporary can be more than just the now. It could be the now of whoever's saying its life. So for me and Mary and Sarah and Joe, right, contemporary for us goes back to also the stuff that was sort of cutting edge when I was in grad school, or even before that when I was an undergrad, right? And that was I graduated college. I graduated in '86, right? So for me, it's like there's these people that were still alive then, and we're sort of really cutting edge, like Frank Stella, who's now kind of old hat, And for you, it would be a very, very different definition because your experience is, half the length of mine, right? So that may only confuse the idea, but you get the idea, right? Okay. Let's see. I have the wrong screen up. Boop, close. There we go. Right. So we're going to look at Cezanne. That's who we're going to start off looking at. Paul Cezanne. He was one of the original Impressionists in 1873 when the Impressionists started their group. But he only showed early on with them, and he sort of split off in his own direction. And he didn't like the bad reviews he got in Impressionist shows, and he moved back to his hometown in the south of France. And in doing that, he was able to really begin to push his art, because he's working in solitary, more or less, right? He's really able to push his art in a way that he might not have been able to do if he was surrounded by a group of other artists. Does that make sense? There's something to be said for the artistic group, right? This cross-pollination, inspiration, right? But then there's something to be said about going out on your own and really, breaking all the rules. And we're going to talk about 2 or 3 artists early on in this class that when we see them leave the comfort of a nurturing artistic community and go off in isolation, they come up with some solutions to things that are extraordinary because of that isolation. Cezanne's one of these. Now, before we go further, the NGA up there, National Gallery of Art, right? I'm going to use local works of art wherever I can, okay? So 9 out of 10 pieces that we look at will come from somewhere within a 50-mile radius, right? Unless it goes to Richmond now and then, right? 100 miles. But I'll tell you what museum it's in. So they all have little, NGA is National Gallery, Phil is the Phillips, right? Krieg is the Krieger, which people tend to ignore. It's a great little collection, right? VMFA, Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. You get the idea, right? and I'll explain them. If you have any questions, just ask, right? If it doesn't have that in front of the artist name, that means it's not in a local collection. Okay, that means it's further afield, like Philadelphia or something like that, right? In fact, there's a Philadelphia picture coming up in this lecture, right? Okay, so Cezanne, when people begin to look back to the roots of modern art, you can even see his name on the flow chart, right? Up the top right corner, right? Cezanne is one of the people that artists in the 20th century, in modernism, look back and say, that's where it starts, right? He's the man. And I got to say that, I mean, I've really come to love Cezanne. If I could paint like anybody, I think he's one of the 4 or 5 people I wish I could paint like. And I wish I had the guts and the daring to do the sorts of things that he did, right? Cezanne died in 1906. He was only in his 60s when he died. He wasn't that old. But God, he looked it, right? Had a beard that would put Adam Kovacs to shame. I mean, just, and just grizzled and sort of his... Anyway, living in Provence, south of France. When he dies in 1906, there's a major retrospective of his paintings in Paris to honor the grand old man, right? Picasso goes to this show. Henri Matisse goes to this show. These are 2 of the heaviest hitters of 20th century art. Somebody asked Picasso, what do you think? Picasso says, Paul Cézanne is like a mother hovering over us, right? He's not telling us what to do. Right? That's the spirit of Cézanne, mother. And Matisse said he's the father of us all, right? None of us would be doing what we're doing if it were not for Cézanne. He's the acknowledged font, the root of all of this, right? So, what is it that they're talking about here with Cézanne? I think this is the brave part, right? First, as an impressionist work, you would expect to see the brushwork sort of broken up, right, into patches of color. And we see that everywhere we look, right? The brushwork put on thickly and broken up. And you can see as you look at this, because of the way the light in the museum was when I took the picture, how thick sometimes that paint gets because he's working over the top of it, keeps reworking it. But for Cézanne, the principal issue, and this is, I think, why he's so important for modern art, is that when he sets up a still life to paint, or when he paints a landscape, he is really not particularly concerned with making the painting look exactly like the thing he's looking at. What he thinks of is that the painting is a project in and of itself, where he's got to put a bunch of parts together in the painting. Right? He's got to make them fit. He's got to make them work. And whether or not they look like that thing in the corner of the studio that he was looking at, that doesn't matter. What matters is whether or not the pieces fit together. And so what he does in his mind, as he's working on paintings, and he says it more eloquently than me, right? I'm not projecting. He wrote about this, right? He would break things apart in his mind. He would sort of deconstruct them. And then sort of put them back together in a way that made pictorial sense to him, where the unity of the parts of the composition was more important than truth to nature. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean he couldn't make it truth to nature. It's just he chose not to. And this is toward the end of his life. So, if we look at this picture, he set up these 2 porcelain jugs, these apples and peaches on plates, and these rugs on this table. And let's just start looking at the table. And look at how the table's been put together in the picture. Look at the perspective in the lower right corner, or the lack thereof, right? You'll see that the slat on the side ends up looking as if it's cobbled together from different pieces of wood, because the perspective is anti-perspective, right? You know how perspective works is the further, like railroad tracks, right? Things come together as they go back into space, but these go apart as they go back into space. Look at the front of the table, and trace the top of the table, the top line across, and see does it line up with on the left? Right? He's jumped it up and down, and he's got some internal logic. That's an internal pictorial logic that is superseding truth to nature. Because for Cezanne, the important thing was this. A picture has two. When we talk about paintings, right, about any art, it has two different natures that we can talk about. Okay? One of these natures is, what is this? What is this? Well, it's a table with some fruit and cloth and some pots, right? We talk about works of art as what they represent. Okay? It's a portrait, it's a landscape, it's a nude sculpture, right? But we talk about it in that term of not of what it represents. On the other hand, any work of art is also an object. This is a piece of canvas with paint on it, stuck in a frame, right? So it has these two different natures. It has these two different beings, right? That makes sense? It's heavy stuff. What Cezanne is saying is that the representational identity of the picture, what it represents, it's still important to him. But what's becoming increasingly important is the fact that the painting is an object over which he has control. And as that becomes more important, this idea that it's an object regardless of what it represents, right? That's what he's kind of leading toward here. It is an object, not a representation. But he's emphasizing its object nature. You can see why, when we think about abstract art, that is an important first step. Because if that's true, that the artist's primary job is to put this stuff together within the edges of this frame in a way that makes sense regardless of what you might see in nature, then the logical end of that is abstract art, isn't it? The logical end is just compositions with shapes that don't represent anything. Cezanne never really went there, but the guys who did couldn't have done it without his help, right? So Cezanne is really looked toward as one of these characters, these figures in the history of art, who did sort of important, wonderful things, right, with painting. And I think that's kind of all I have to say about Cezanne. Let's look at some of these pictures. This one's a little bit blurry. But it's not blurry on my screen, so I don't know. This is not working out well. My Wi-Fi, I have to talk to IT. But there's the side of the table. But you can also see the other thing that Cezanne is doing is he consciously, purposefully leaves bits unfinished. Right? He doesn't cover every bit of the painting with paint. So the lower part of that molding at the bottom, the part that's closest to us, has some bare canvas poking through, right? It leaves it looking somewhat unfinished, like it's a work in progress almost, right? And sometimes his work's even more like that. There. The pot in the back on the right, he's made this rather wild decision. It's a round pot, but he makes it look as if it's like a semicircle, doesn't he? Because he's just flattened off the back of it. He doesn't continue the circle around. And the point is that he wanted that horizontal line to come through, right? And just the more you look at it, the more you go, this is really daring, right? Look at this peach, and there's an outline of some place where he meant to put it in the first place, and he decided, no, I'm going to move it down a little bit, but he left it there, right? And all of these things are not, again, where his end result is, I've got to make it look exactly like what he saw. The end result is he likes the way those things work together on the canvas, right? As a composition, these abstract qualities. Another still life in the National, all the same issues, right? Look at the side of the table. And you may say to me, gee, Mark, maybe he just never took his perspective class, right? But that's not the case. He's making these choices. If we trace his career, we can find that these are there. But again, the table on the right is breaking apart. That dish, that platter, doesn't seem to rest down on the tabletop. It seems to kick up at us a bit, right? The front edge of the table, these are wonderful things. He just all of a sudden, he obliterates the edge, right? And it sort of disappears at certain parts of the composition. right? And then that wonderful that wine goblet back there, right? And I think I've got a detail of that, right? Where you can see it's almost like he's finding it there and he's moving it around. But again, we're looking sort of down on the top of it, and through the rest of the glass, we look at the side of it at once, right? Giving us these multiple views. And I think on a certain level, for Cezanne, this is more realistic in a way. Because as I'm walking around the room, right, I'm seeing you now here, but I was seeing you from over here before, and my mind is sort of thinking about both of these views at once, right? And what Cezanne is, he's capturing experience here, right? The way in which we experience this, because we don't stand stock still, right? We have two eyes anyway, so we're always seeing something from multiple points of view, right? So these paintings are just really wonderful sort of rule-breaking pictures, right? We have got. We're so lucky here. Go to. If you lived in New York, you go to MoMA, and you have to muscle people both sides and get to see their Cezannes, right, or the Met. We've got a room of about a dozen Cezannes at any given time. The National Gallery's got about 18 of them or so, right? There are always at least 8 to 10 of them out at any given moment, right? Including 2 from the White House on permanent loan from the White House. It's not Trump that did it. They were under Obama as well, right? I'd like to blame, but I don't. Right? Landscapes as well. Like this is again very late in his career, and the same sort of thing where he's breaking things up and putting them back together, regardless of what inspired them. So we've got this road moving around a sort of rocky outcrop on the left, and some trees off to the right, and maybe a distant hill in the background with the sky. But there's something quite abstract about it all, right? Because in order to understand these trees, what he's done is he's broken them up into this series of sort of Legos, or patches of color. And he puts them back together, and he gives us some things where he's been inspired, right? The swirly lines that you see are, inspired by certain trees and whatnot. But at the same time, he's really kind of interested in how those colors sort of fit together on the canvas. And while the rocks seem to rise on the left on a certain level, at a certain point, if you look at it long enough, they stop doing that. They start just becoming flat on the surface of the canvas. This is especially apparent at the very top of the rocks on the left, where you can see the top of the rock isn't even painted, right? And all of a sudden that makes you really aware that you're not looking through a window to an extension of space. What you're looking at is a bunch of paint on a surface. And leaving it unfinished adds to that, right? And this is, I think, most apparent if we look at the road at the bottom, which doesn't really so much recede as sort of look like a tongue, coming up, a fin of a shark, right? Sort of, there's something about that just sits up this way and looks at you. The tree trunk on the right is just kind of inexplicable, right? There's a tree trunk there along the right border, and you follow up and it's gone, right? And there's no sort of explanation, it doesn't really fit with anything else, right? And I think, like I said, he's getting away with a lot of this. He's thinking, that sounds judgmental, getting away with it. He's moving in this direction because he's not part of a community. He's really just kind of all by himself, and apparently he was pretty irascible as well. It was not pretty easy to get along with at the same time. Even some of his childhood friends sort of wrote him off, right? But there we can see this. You dive into this, and all of a sudden it becomes this explosion of paint, right? And what you become aware with Cezanne, I think that's kind of an important point. What you become aware with Cezanne is that it's not a tree, it's not a horizon, it's paint, right? And you look, that's paint, that's all that is. And I think that's why I love it so much, right? It's a celebration of paint, right? Independent from the subject matter. And what we'll see is not only this fragmentation that he's doing, this breaking of things apart into constituent elements and reconstructing them, but also his love of color. These things are going to have such an impact on early 20th century art, like huge impact, right? That one didn't change, so we'll try it again. There we go, right? And everywhere we look, and sometimes what is with that red stripe? That one red blast in the middle of it, right? And keep in mind that he worked on this for a while and he left it unfinished. It was in the studio when he died in 1906. But at a certain level, he must have been kind of okay with it, you know? Maybe he was upset and he wanted to move on. I don't think that's really the case, right? But there are these things that just happen in these saisons that he makes happen that really we can't explain well, right? Look at that. Again, I'm jealous as heck, right? If I could paint like anybody, man, he's got it going, right? And again, you can see the degree to which now we see this in detail, right? This top of the road as it curves. This is the road curving around that rock. But it isn't, is it? It's just a flat surface with color on it. This is Cezanne's great strength. And as he moves through his career, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So this one's in the Phillips collection. He rented a house, not rented, he had a house. He was very wealthy, as a matter of fact. His dad was, I forget what he did, but he did not want Paul Cézanne to be a painter. He's kind of upset at him as a kid when he took up painting. His dad was I can't remember if he was a stockbroker or just a merchant. They had this palace of a house in Aix-en-Provence, where he was from, where he ended up moving back, right? And when his father died, he inherited everything. So if we think about the other thing about Cézanne, sort of exploding the rules. And I think if anything about modern art, exploding the rules is going to be big, right? That's going to be just conscious rule breaking. Iconoclasm, if you will, right? Which I think is something, a healthy thing. I'm too conservative in my art. That's why I teach art history. I'm too conservative in my making of art. The idea that all the rules are there, you learn them so that you can kick them down the road. You know? You learn them so you can say no. You learn them first. He had this, so his father, anyway, left him this ton of money. And in addition to being all by himself and being able to explore without somebody saying that's wrong, he also had so much money that he didn't have to sell another painting for the rest of his life. Right? He didn't have to match a market demand, which is always a great benefit, right? To have that as a possibility, to not have to care about money. Right? He had both of these things in Provence. And in addition to his dad, you can go visit, right, the Cézanne house. I was in Aix summer before last, and I walked, I was with my mother, so she didn't want to go, and I didn't go. And I looked at it between the railings because it was too early in the morning to get inside, but I wanted to see Cézanne's house. And it's still there, and it's open for visits. We had to make an appointment months in advance. In addition to that, he had a little house on the hill. Aix sits on this hill. And up on the hill, he had this house, Les Loves, it was called. And it was a garden out back. And it's kind of on the outskirts of town. And from there, you can see this mountain in the horizon, Mont Sainte-Victoire. It's about 3,000 feet tall. It's this big granite mountain, right? It looms over the city. But from the heart of town, you can't really see it, right? There's trees and hills. But from his garden, you could. And that's what he's painted here. Even though you can't tell. Right? There's a mountain here. And let me show you another picture of Mont Sainte-Victoire so you get a sense. Right? This is in Philadelphia. Right? So this is the mountain that looms over Aix, right? And this is painted from the same vantage point. Right? And I used to think that this was it here. But I think that's the bottom part. Right? I think that this is it over here. You getting that? Even though he's not really, this is probably an unfinished picture, right? I really thought of it as an unfinished picture. But he's mapping it out, and you can see from looking at this, his process. And I think these two side by side make a nice pair this way. Because what he does is he looks at the landscape out there, and instead of trying to get the outlines right and get the details of it right, what he's doing is he's saying, boom, it's this, and there's some red, there's some orange, there's some green, right? And he's knitting it together from this patchwork quilt of colors. And what's I think is wonderful about Cézanne is the degree to which he will bring the colors from the sky down into the landscape, and the colors from the landscape back up into the sky. Because as he's putting it back together, it's not necessary that you have sky color limited to the sky. And it's not necessary that you have the green limited to the ground, right? And I think with the Phillips picture, you can see this even stronger, right? Look at how much of the blue of the sky is now down in below the horizon. right? Down at the bottom. Some of them might end up being houses and whatnot. Hard to say at this point. But he's broken it all apart, and he's putting things back together in a way that makes object sense, pictorial sense, rather than representational sense. If you ever get to Philadelphia, they get great saisons in Philadelphia. Right? This is one of my favorites. He painted the entire thing, and he left the top of the mountains bare canvas, which I just like. How can you build this entire composition and say, I'm just going to do that part, I'm not going to touch that part? And it's the most physical part of the painting, in a way, of the representation, right? It's the top of the mountain, it's never eroded away. And he leaves it blank. I think it's phenomenal as a painterly choice, right? So, let's see. Some nice details here as well. Even the stuff that looks like bare canvas has actually been painted at this point, right? And he's got some drizzles there that he's eventually going to probably paint over as he's drawn on it. But these things are available to modern artists, right? And they're aware of sort of these this approach to painting that is divorcing itself from representation. Right? That's the key lesson of Cezanne, is that a painter's job is not necessarily to represent the visible world, but to be inspired by that. What is any painter's job? What is any artist's job? To get you to see the world different, I think, on a certain level. It's not just replicate nature and show off how good a draftsman is. They can all do that, right? But the point really should be, right, when you make a painting or a print, is that when somebody looks at that, they should think twice about their experience. And if it's just Jesse, your horses, right? They should think about the horses differently, right? See something they hadn't seen before, because they get to see it through your eyes, right? And that's if it's not representation, then understand other things perhaps. Lead us to be thinking about something entirely different, something that's maybe has nothing to do with the physical world, right? I will guarantee you that if you look at enough Cezanne, you're going to walk outside and you're going to look at those humid storm clouds in a whole different way, right? Because what he does is he makes solid things look like voids, right? And he makes empty things look solid, because he paints them both the same way, right? And this is particularly clear in the Philadelphia picture we just had up, right? If you look at the sky, there's a cloud there on the right, right? But if it weren't for a few of the lines, I would defy you to tell me why that's sky and that's mountain. You know? Because they're both the same thing, right? What about that bit of gray right there, and this one right down here? You know? Everything is the same because, again, he's trying to put the different parts. They all have a role to play in the composition, right? When I was an undergrad, I saw Cezanne. I walked outside and went, yeah, I get it, right? You see trees and you start to see them differently. And that's what all art should do, right? It should make you stop taking things for granted. See something in a new and a different way, right? And I think really that's what makes Cezanne such a wonderful painter, right? That and these blasts of pure color, right? That when you see them in detail, that could be a painting from the 1950s, right? From New York in the 1950s. Because there really is no, as he's laying the paint down, it is hard for you and me to see how he saw that as being at all representational. And how he saw it as anything other than just paint on a canvas, right? He did it with figurative art as well, right? Another Philadelphia picture, The Great Bathers. He worked on this theme of bathers for the longest time. I have a couple of wonderful quotes from Cezanne. One is that when he left the Impressionists, I mentioned he was one of the founding members of the Impressionists, right? And when he left the Impressionists, he said that the problem with the Impressionists was that they are not going to make paintings that are lasting and permanent, like the kind of stuff you see in museums. Now, these days that's hard to understand because we see Impressionists in museums everywhere, right? But he said, they don't have permanence. They don't have the lasting quality of paintings in museums. That's one thing he said. The other great quote by Cezanne, that is something we've been talking about, is that nature should be seen in terms of the cone, the cylinder, and the sphere. And as we look at these pictures, you start to see that what he's doing is he's breaking, and what he means by that, not necessarily a cone, a cylinder, a sphere. He means generic objects, generic shapes, simplified shapes, right? Break nature down to the cone, the cylinder, the sphere. And for him, again, he's not drawing geometric shapes, but the idea is that it breaks down to simple forms that he then puts back together again, right? Now back to that first quote. We're not making paintings like you see in museums. This led Cezanne to take on certain themes that had permanence in his mind. And the idea of the bathers was a theme, it's not changing for me, there we go, was a theme that brought his works closer to Renaissance art. Here's a Titian in London of Diana. It's a mythological scene. So this is, a birthplace of art, Greek mythology, right? But rendered through the Italian Renaissance, where this idea of women bathing in the nude in the outdoors conjures up this sort of mythological, perfect ideal past, right? Timelessness in and of itself. And the story here is Actaeon is a hunter. You see his bow, he's dropped it, and his dog behind him. While out hunting, he accidentally stumbles on Diana, the goddess of the hunt. And he finds her and her maidens bathing, which is, you don't see goddesses naked, right? You mortal humans. And so he's surprised, right? Oh, sorry. Right? And he's dropped his bow. This is kind of cute, but it's like, whoa. And he's pushing out the curtain, and there's Diana on the right with her servant, and the dog barking at her, right? And the story is that Actaeon, for having committed this grave sin of looking upon a goddess naked, even though it's an accident, that never seems just to me, she turns him into a deer, and his own dogs eat him alive, right? So the dog in the lower left corner is our harbinger of what's about to happen to Actaeon. What I love about Cezanne is we're Actaeon, right? There is no Actaeon here. So we're the ones who have stumbled on these mythological bathers, right? But look at, again, the idea of the structure of the composition, right? For Cezanne, how he brings the trees together in this big apex, this triangle in the center that sort of anchors everything. And the trees are not functioning so much as trees as they are compositional elements around that huge triangle in the center. And how he aligns some of the bathers with the trees, but at the same time he breaks everything apart and puts it back together again so that when you look at certain sections of the painting, it's hard to figure out what's meant to be tree, solid in front, what's meant to be sky in the back. And he particularly plays with this when we get between the trunks, where all of a sudden that play of front and back, because he lays the paint of the sky on last, right? And it ends up pushing forward to you, so that the cumulative effect is, well, yes, there's a house, there's a church in the background, right? A lake, a guy with a horse, only briefly sketched it. The overall effect is that you're looking at all this paint laid onto a flat surface. The flatness gets reasserted again and again and again, right, through the course of the painting. He must have done 30 of these, right? Bather images. We've got a little one. This one is about like yay in the National Gallery. The one in Philadelphia, the women are over life-size. It's huge, right? Gigantic picture. One of 3 he did at the end of his career, bathers. And sort of this culmination of this interest in that as a compositional theme. Here's one from, Okay, no, it's not. These are connecting by Wi-Fi, and sometimes the Wi-Fi of late has, there we go. Here's one in Baltimore where he's working on some of the same issues, Baltimore Museum of Art, where you can see the obliteration of the figure often, right? He comes in and he just makes them sort of meld into their background, turns faces into these spheres and cones and cylinders, right? And their bodies, leaves vast portions of it unpainted. Figures turn out to meld with their background, right? He obliterates the distinction between front and back. And again, he's not interested so much in representation. The figure, I love this, right? Whereas he's working on it, he's in there, and he's got this figure set in front of the tree, and he's aligned her with the tree. And then he's decided, well, I'm going to work on this space between the trees, right? And all of a sudden, it just breaks into the figure. That's okay, because it's not about the representation. It's about the composition. And he felt internally that this needed that extra blue that then comes down and gets picked up down here on our haunches as well. Right? But ends up sort of denying any kind of logic to the figure itself. Right, one down here sort of disappears into the background. But it's just really sort of brave ways of breaking all the rules. And that's exactly what we're going to see as we look at modern art, is this ongoing attempt to sort of take what's been done already and break it even further, push it even further. And Cezanne really, for almost everybody, stands at the beginning of this. Right? So on what's today? Tuesday. On Friday, right? What's in the water there? Right? Some sort of sea creature or something, right? On Friday, we'll be looking at another 19th century movement called Symbolism, which, while Cezanne, formally speaking, right, talking about how paintings are made, sets the stage for modern art in one direction, Symbolism, insofar as the ideas they're interested in, sets the stage in another, right? And so that's what we'll look at on Friday. And hopefully I'll be able to wrap that up on Friday, too, and get us next week into early 20th century. Okay? So if you want to read ahead on the stuff on the Symbolism. It's on the OERs, sections on that, and a lot of that will be helpful for review as well. Okay? If you have any questions about anything, please come by my office for my office hours.